Okay, so hi, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have questions or if I'm being unclear or whatever, or you can use the chat. I've got that open as well. I know some of you, but not everybody who's in here, so I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm Diane. In the SCA, I'm Lady Ursula de Strattone, and I'm in the Barony of Arnhold in the Kingdom of Artemisia, which is Treasure Valley, Boise area of Idaho. And I have been playing in the SCA since 2013. And sauerkraut was something that I kind of liked doing before the SCA, but when I learned that it was actually documentable, I started making it more for SCA events. We even had some friends a few years ago, and we made an all-period documentable sandwich and entered it in an ANS competition as a group project. We had bread, mustard, sauerkraut, cheese, preserved meats, all from period recipes, and it was a really fun experiment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and some modern considerations such as safety and weird things you might experience, materials you need. Oh, Atlantia, hi. And we'll talk about any questions you might have and just some ideas for what you can do with this. So first of all, the preserving of salted foods goes way back, like at least Roman Empire. The preserving specifically of vegetables was probably done for quite a while as well, but the earliest documentation I was able to find of a written source for a salted preserved cabbage is from a cookbook in 1616. So it's just outside of period, but if it was written down in a cookbook, that probably means it was happening before that. So I'm going to share a couple of files with you guys for later. I'm just going to put them in the chat here. I entered some sauerkraut in an ANS competition a few years ago, and so I'm going to send you a link to my blog that has the documentation. And then I also have taught this class several times, so I'm going to send you the blog page that has my class handout as well. And that's got recipes, it's got information about my sources, so don't feel like you need to be frantically scribbling notes, but if you want to, you're obviously welcome to. So let me back myself up a little bit here. So there are a lot of ways that food was preserved in the Middle Ages, just like we do now, because sometimes all of the food is ripe at the same time. Sometimes it's because it tastes better that way. Sometimes it's to enhance your diet with more variety. Other methods of preservation are focused on either just sealing oxygen out of food. So you might cover food with fat or butter or gelatin or honey. Those are they just keep the oxygen out, and that's the way they preserve the food. The other ways that we preserve food is by creating an environment that is inhospitable to microbes based on either acidity. A high sugar content can also discourage microbial growth, or just the salinity. Also, there's obviously air drying and smoking, and sometimes these methods are combined. So sauerkraut is part of the preserving tradition called brining. It was also used for all kinds of other pickled food items, including meats. It's good for all kinds of produce. The only thing you really have to be aware of is how much sugar content is in the produce you're preserving. So even some vegetables, it's hard to brine and preserve, just because if there's a high enough sugar content, you have to put so much salt in to counteract it that it's really unpalatable. Basically, the way brining works is that you have a high enough salt environment that the harmful bacteria are unable to survive in it. Same with molds, same with most yeasts. You're also keeping the food completely submerged in a liquid, which protects it from oxygen or from things that are floating through the air. And finally, the brine actually encourages a type of bacteria called lactic acid bacteria, and there's a variety of different types of lactic acid bacteria. And actually, through the brining process, those different bacteria vary in population size. So when you're tasting the sourness of sauerkraut, what you're tasting is lactic acid, rather than a traditional vinegar pickle where you're tasting acetic acid. But it's a very similar process. Lactobacillus is very territorial. That's the main bacteria that is developing the lactic acid in sauerkraut. It's very territorial, and it basically kills off other bacteria, and other bacteria don't like that high acid environment or the high salt environment. And lactobacillus is also present in yogurt, kefir, kombucha, other brined pickles like kimchi. And it's also very well known and has been shown to help with digestive issues, stomach upsets. And you see that in some of the period sources on sauerkraut, that it has a reputation for settling the stomach. So let me just open this other document here. In the humor system of medicine, cabbage was known as a hot and dry food, which kind of seems counterintuitive to me because I think of it as this cool, moist thing. So it was used to balance your humors if you were excessively phlegmatic. It also, because of that drying nature, was thought to clear out your vocal cords. There's a source called Das Kochbuch des Meisters Eberhard that says that it's good for making you sing well. So, yeah, just flipping through to see if there are any other period sources that I have left out. Let me go back to my class handout here. So my personal opinion about why, sorry, did I have a question in there? Oh, Abby says kimchi. Oh, and we have a West Kingdom person in here as well. Hello, Rose. So we'll talk a little bit more about kimchi as we move through, but it's very similar. Basically, it's sauerkraut with pepper paste in it. So as I was saying, period sources for sauerkraut are kind of sparse. Like I said, the 1616 cookbook is the first recipe I can find for sauerkraut. I think that this is kind of like bread making, where everybody already knew how to do it, so why would you write it down? All you need is a knife, a container, and some salt, and it's very, very simple process. You don't even really need to be sterile in your preparations because the salt content and the lactobacillus pretty much take care of it. But that Danish source from 1616, it's just called Kokebog, cookbook. It says to pickle cabbage, chop it finely, sprinkle it well, each layer by itself in a container or barrel. Between each layer, sprinkle salt, cumin, and juniper berries, and put a good weight on him. 4 or 5 days. Thereafter, pour vinegar over it. So that sounds pretty good to me. I don't usually use vinegar in my sauerkraut, and my intuition is that it's more of a flavoring agent than necessarily a preservative, because after 5 days in that amount of salt, cabbage would be perfectly preserved. One of the things I like about homemade sauerkraut is it stays crunchy. You're not heat preserving it like you are with pickling, and it retains its nutrient value. It's pretty much stable forever. I mean, I've kept it in the fridge for up to 6 months and it seems okay. So I'm going to show you, this is, let me get my camera back up so I can actually see. I've been looking at my stuff here. So this is the traditional looking sauerkraut crock. It's just a stoneware crock. It's glazed, and you can see it's got this lip around the inside where you, after you put the lid on, the idea is that you pour water in there and it creates an airtight seal so that stuff doesn't get in and out, and it keeps your sauerkraut from evaporating. And then it's got these two little stone, they're just unglazed ceramic weights that fit inside to press the sauerkraut down and keep it underneath the liquid. Idaho's so dry though that I honestly have to go in fairly regularly and add liquid to my sauerkraut if it's at all warm out. But the sources that I could find talked about preserving it in barrels. A wooden vessel, the benefit of a wooden vessel would actually be that the bacterial colony would stay in the wood, so your sauerkraut would ferment faster as you make multiple batches in the same thing. Obviously, eventually the wood would break down, but wood's very convenient. So let's make some sauerkraut. And before I get to that part, does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to jump in and add? Has anybody done this before?
I haven't done this before, but does the crock have to be lidded?
It helps to have some kind of covering just so that it doesn't evaporate as quickly. Honestly, a lot of times I make this in a mason jar, and I'll just either put the lid on and keep it kind of loose, or one of the other tricks I've seen is sort of making an airlock style where the bubbles can come out, but it keeps the liquid down. I've actually just taken a plastic bag, filled it with water, and set that inside the jar, and so that presses down the cabbage and lets the air bubble out. If you're not covering it at all, though, you just have to watch and make sure that you don't get too much liquid evaporation, but
okay.
It works just fine. So I have a head of cabbage. I'm going to kind of Julia Child this with you guys, and we'll see how it goes. The modern instructions I have seen suggest that in order to be food safe, you want about a 2% brine solution. So 2% of the weight of your cabbage, you want that amount of salt. For me, it usually works out to about 3 tablespoons of salt for a normal side head of cabbage. As far as what vegetables to avoid, if you're doing 100% of any one vegetable, the only one I've really had trouble with is onions because they are very high sugar content. Often what I'll do is a mix. So I'll do cabbage and then I'll add some carrots, or I'll add some radishes or whatever else I have lying around. Carrots I've done by themselves. The only other thing to probably avoid is really soft vegetables. I've done tomatoes before. I've made fermented salsa, but it does kind of get softer. My favorite is a mix of cabbage and carrots, though, so I'm just going to do cabbage today. The other thing that's nice if you're a beginner with sauerkraut is if you buy purple cabbage, the purple cabbage is a pH indicator. So you can tell when your sauerkraut has gotten acidic and when it's ready because it goes from purple to pink. And it's a really fun little science experiment. I won a competition once with hot pink sauerkraut that was made with purple cabbage and jalapenos. And oh man, that's really good on like sausage or something. So with your cabbage, I usually remove any of the outside leaves that are really gross. They don't have to be perfect. And then before you start cutting up, I always take a whole leaf and save it. And the reason for that is once you've got all your sauerkraut ready to ferment, you can take that whole leaf and sort of tuck it on top of your sauerkraut as a sort of a lid that keeps everything under the liquid. I used to tell people to do it with a piece of plastic, and then I realized, like, no, cabbage already has something like that. So it doesn't have to be perfect. I'll probably just tear this into pieces and do that to cover my crock up and just sort of keep everything under. I'm going to go back so you can see my countertop here. It's one of the things you want to try and do to help speed up fermentation is you want as much surface area as possible with the cabbage. I don't like to shred it because it basically becomes confetti, but I have this fabulous little moolie. It's essentially like a hand crank food processor. A mandolin slicer works great. A food processor works great too. I just like this because it travels really well. When I teach this class in person, often what I'll do is I'll bring a couple heads of cabbage and pass this around while I'm talking and let everybody just kind of crank for a while and do my work for me. This is one of those great like Tom Sawyer classes where I don't know, you guys, do you really think you can handle cutting up my vegetables for me? So, but if you're just slicing it with a knife, you just want to try and slice it as thinly as possible. Bigger chunks will work just fine. It just takes it longer to ferment, and it's hard to get it to produce enough liquid to create enough brine. You can use the same technique, like if you think about traditional, like Jewish deli dill pickles, they're brined pickles. They're not vinegar pickles. So I've done this with cucumbers a lot of times before, and in that kind of situation, you basically make a 2% brine solution. So you, I think it's like, it works out to about a tablespoon of salt per quart of water, and then you cover your vegetables with that. I don't know if you guys can even hear me talking while I'm cranking there.
Yes, the sound is good.
Okay, good, thanks. I have a little food scale that I got on Amazon for about 10 bucks. If you're really worried about your salt levels, something like that is really good to have. This is mine. It's one of those ones that you could stick in your purse if you were a dieter. But I've done this enough times that I know usually about 3 tablespoons of salt is enough. So you can see this just gives you little shreds. And once I get a bit going here, we'll talk about how to get it into your vessel. The important thing is you want to keep everything submerged in liquid and keep the oxygen out. So you're really going to have to pack it down into your vessel. One of the other questions I get a lot is, can you use the stem of the cabbage? And you absolutely can. You just end up with like bigger bites, essentially. But there's no reason to not eat it, in my opinion. So I have kosher salt. That's what I'm going to use. Sea salt or pickling salt are also good. You just want non-iodized salt because iodine can cause weird flavors in your sauerkraut. I've never done it. So I don't really know what the weird flavors are, but I imagine it would work. It might just taste a little different. One other warning, one other thing I didn't know, I love putting garlic in my sauerkraut, and I'm going to grab some here in a second. Garlic has a very high copper content, and if your water comes from certain regions of the US that have a little bit of sulfur, and actually, if you know anything about cabbage, you know it's got sulfur in it, that will cause a reaction in your garlic and it can turn your garlic blue. So if your sauerkraut has blue in it and you've used garlic, that's probably why. So I'm just throwing this cabbage in here. Usually what I do is kind of like in the recipe I shared where I put some cabbage in, I sprinkle some salt on top, add some more cabbage, add some more salt. If you're doing this with jars or something, you can just put the shredded cabbage into a bowl and salt it, and you can let it develop that way before you put it into the jar. So I'm just going to do a big handful of salt. Kosher salt is a little bit coarser, so you have to use a little bit more because it's less dense. So I'm just putting a big handful in there. I have a rolling pin. This is my tool of choice. And the next thing you want to do is you just want to kind of massage the cabbage, pack it down, and you're sort of encouraging the cell walls to break down and to release the liquids that are in there. So I'm pretty vigorous with my cabbage. I'm pounding on it here. And you just want to squash it down so you don't have any air pockets. You will have some, but that really, it got it down from about that full to about that full. So you can be pretty rough with it. And if you're doing this in a bowl, you can just massage it with your hands, or it's very satisfying to squash it with something, whack it with something. Okay, so now I'm going to do some more cabbage. Obviously the traditional, if you go to a beer house, you're probably going to get caraway seeds or juniper berries in your sauerkraut. Those are both really good. I love garlic in my sauerkraut. I love adding other vegetables. Hot peppers are really, there's something about that flavor when it ferments that I just really like. So get creative. Any spices you've got are fine, as long as you're also adding enough salt. that recipe that we talked about earlier had cumin and juniper berries, so that's one that I haven't tried before. But I have some whole cumin seeds, so maybe I should. In Japanese cooking, they do a lot of brined pickles, including sour plums, and you'll see a lot of Japanese recipes call for the juice of those pickles, and it really adds that salty, umami, tangy flavor. So I've started experimenting with using the liquid from my sauerkraut in salad dressings, in stuff where I want it to be a little salty, but I want a little more interesting flavor. And you see old wives' tales once in a while that drinking sauerkraut juice is healthy. It's very, I mean, it's kind of trendy right now, but I just like it because it tastes good. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and sauerkraut is one of her favorite foods. I don't know, probably because I eat it a lot, but. Okay, so here's another chunk of cabbage, and I'm just going to do the same thing. You can see there's still lots of room in my crock. If you have one of those canning funnels that has the wide mouth, those are really helpful for loading your jars up too, and even just a wooden spoon or something to cram everything down. So, layering in this next layer. Now what you'll start to notice is that the liquid will be starting to come out of your cabbage leaves as you do this. If you are vigorous enough with your, here's a bunch more salt. If you're vigorous enough with your massaging and you leave it long enough, you can easily make sauerkraut where you don't have to add any additional liquid. It all just comes from the cabbage. I've experimented with doing that versus just covering it with extra water, and I haven't noticed any difference in the outcomes, the texture, anything like that. So I'm impatient, and usually as soon as I get done filling my crock, I put the liquid in and I let it start fermenting. Got a little bit of a yucky spot on there. If you don't compost, that's another fun thing to start this time of year. My garden is very happy about all my compost. So this crock actually will hold 2 heads of cabbage. This is the half-gallon model. I got given it, but I got told it's from Amazon. So if you're looking for one, they're very reasonable. I've seen giant ones, you know, once in a while at a thrift store, you'll see a 5-gallon one where it's like, there's your entire lifetime supply of sauerkraut. But yeah, that's not going to fit. But I haven't sprung for that. My preference is usually to use jars just because I like making different flavors. I don't want to eat the same sauerkraut forever. And they do start to, they continue to ferment as you use them, even if you have it in the fridge. So if you don't like it super sour, making smaller quantities is fine. And 1 head of cabbage for me is usually 2-quart jars of sauerkraut. If you're planning for a feast for your SCA group, 4 quarts of sauerkraut fed about 40 people when I did this for a SCA feast a few years ago. And I did a bunch of different flavors so people could try them out. So when you're fermenting your sauerkraut, it doesn't like light exposure, although I've had times where I did wind up having my, you know, it's in a clear jar and it's on the countertop, and it still worked okay. It just can cause the cabbage to kind of break down a little bit more. So if you have a cupboard, that's good. And it really prefers a cooler environment over a warm environment. So 60 to 70 degrees is better than 70 to 80. Now, I still make sauerkraut in the summer and when my house gets hot, but you have to watch it because it ferments faster. And at higher temperatures, you're more likely to get a little bit of yeast growth. Now, if you get yeast growth in your sauerkraut, it's still perfectly safe to eat, but it tastes yeasty. You'll often see the most common type of yeast in fermented foods is called Kahm yeast, K-A-H-M. and it looks like an either kind of light pink or white, sort of filmy or powdery look on top of your crock. It's not harmful. Actually, cam yeast, you can't even really taste it. Usually when I find it, I just get a spoon and scoop it out and toss it, because my family is sometimes fussy. This is a living food though, so you have to gird your loins a little bit and let go of the ideas that you've learned from sell-by dates. Even a little bit of mold, like white mold on the top of your sauerkraut, if there's a leaf that's exposed to the air, it's not going to hurt the sauerkraut that's underneath. It's going to be nice and safe from all that salt you're using. You can just scoop it out, and any leaves that look like they might have been affected, toss those, and the rest is okay. The only things to watch out for are blackish or bluish molds. Those ones are ones that will impact your flavor more. But really, with the salt content this high, you're not going to make yourself sick making sauerkraut. It's too salty for botulism, which is the one you really have to be careful of. So that's kind of reassuring to me. That said, my last batch did get moldy on top, and because it was gone, like by the time the mold started, we'd eaten most of it, so I did just go ahead and chuck it. But cooler temperatures, making sure your balance of salt is right, those will both help. That said, if your salt content is too high, first of all, it doesn't taste great, but secondly, it will inhibit fermentation. It will get so salty that the lactobacillus and other lactic acid bacteria just can't grow. So in that situation, there's not a lot you can do besides add more vegetables and more liquid. Getting close, almost done here. My crock's about half full. If you're adding other things for flavoring, you can just layer those right in with the sauerkraut. You know, when you add your salt, that's when you could add a layer of minced garlic or spices. I tell people this just about every time I teach this class, but one of my favorite ways to eat sauerkraut is on chili. And I don't know why. I think I made a chili one point that was just bland and boring and I wasn't into it. And a couple spoonfuls of sauerkraut with the kind of cold, crunchy, salty really spiced up those boring beans. So I have my last little bit here. I'm just going to sort of cut down to where the neck is pretty solid. When I used to keep chickens, they loved getting these cabbage hearts, but I'll just toss that in the compost. Obviously, you'll get a fair amount of variation in the sizes of your shredded bits, and that's not a problem. You're not going to get aesthetically perfect results with this because it's just not that kind of food. So you've got your sauerkraut in your crock. It's all done. You're fermenting it. You want it in a dark place. You want to keep it at a relatively cool temperature. And most people like sauerkraut that's been fermented between 1 to 2 weeks. That's usually enough to give it like a sour, tangy flavor without making it totally overpowering. And at that point, if you're happy with how your sauerkraut tastes, all you have to do is put it in the fridge. And that colder environment will inhibit the fermentation and it'll stop getting more sour. A lot of times I just store mine on the kitchen counter, and so it does continue to get more sour as you let it sit there, which I don't mind, but if you have picky eaters, something to think about. And it'll keep in the fridge pretty much indefinitely. You know, when this was traditionally made, people would make it in the fall when they harvested their cabbages, and they'd eat it all winter long. And they certainly weren't refrigerating. You'd have it in your cellar or whatever. I've taken it on camping trips. I've taken it to places where you don't have as stable a temperature, and it's usually still okay. I personally prefer it cold, but whatever. Okay, so there's all the rest. My crock is pretty full, but as soon as I get my rolling pin back out, I can cram it down in there. You want probably an inch of headspace at the top of your container because things are going to bubble and move around and develop. But then again, like I said, you'll also want to watch and make sure it doesn't dry out. I check mine every couple days. And if you need to, you know, I just put a pinch of salt in a cup, fill it with water, and use that to rehydrate everything. On this for a minute. Sorry, it's going to be noisy. So you can see, even just with that little bit, it was right up to the lip, and now I've got, you know, 2 inches of space in there. So you've done all that. You've added whatever you want to add. So now, like I said, I'm going to take those whole cabbage leaves that I saved from the beginning, and I'm just going to sort of tuck it on top. I'm pressing it down around the edges, so you're basically just tucking in your little shredded bits so that they won't float up above the liquid. This is your nice natural lid. I'm just going to really cram everything down. I've got these weights I'm going to put on top. Like I was saying earlier, a plastic bag full of water is another really easy way to weight everything and keep it down. Another tip I've seen when you're using a canning jar, so for example, you might have a quart jar like this. You get all your cabbage in, you put your leaf on top. And then between your leaf and the top of the jar, you take one of these little jelly jars. This won't fit in here, but you can take a smaller jar, set it on top, and then screw the lid down on top of that, and that'll press everything down. So if you have some object that's the right size to push everything down, honestly, that's not as critical. If you've got your leaves in there to keep everything tucked under, it shouldn't give you too much trouble. As you can see from the way I'm doing this, this is not an exact science. So now, I did not leave this long enough for any liquid really to come out of the cabbage. Normally, I would let this sit for, half an hour or something on my kitchen counter and just process. All of those cut edges are where the cell walls have been broken and the salt can get in and through osmosis pull that water out. But like I said earlier, I've never really seen that it makes much difference to your final outcome, whether you let it do that or whether you just add water. It's just kind of, it's how much juice you're going to have at the end. So here's my nice little heraldic water adding implement. Now, another thing, I've seen a lot of places that have said, do not use tap water, don't use chlorinated water for sauerkraut, because the chlorine will, if your water is chlorinated, it will inhibit the bacterial growth. That hasn't been my experience, especially because since this is sitting out open, it'll evaporate just like you would do if you're watering your houseplants or using your fish tank, those kinds of things. And honestly, these bacteria are pretty robust. I like tap water. I'm trying to like save a tree and not use a million plastic water bottles. So I put a full pint of water in here, and it's still not, once everything kind of percolates down through the leaves, it's still not, you want the water level to be over the top of your cabbage. So I'm going to add another one. And just let that settle out. You may be able to hear my grumpy kiddo in the background. It's her nap time. So that's staying pretty stable over the top of the stones in there. So this is probably good. It is settling down a little bit, but really that's all there is to it. Now I'm going to put the lid on and pour a little water in the lip of the crock. this evaporates really fast. I usually have to check this every couple days. So now you can see it's essentially an airtight seal. The bubbles and whatever can still get out, but nothing's going to crawl in there. And now this is ready to just sit. I can leave this on my countertop since it's opaque, but when I make it in jars, I just stick them in the back of a cupboard. You might want to make a note for yourself on your calendar to check it in a couple of days. I usually check mine first at about 5 days to a week, taste it, see how I like it, and then you can leave it for longer or you can put it in the fridge. If it's hotter, it'll ferment faster. And depending on what your cabbage situation is like I've made this with kale before rather than cabbage, and kale seems to ferment faster. So just something to check, and like I said, taste it, see what your personal preference is. Keep an eye on your water levels. But that's the basic gist of it. I don't know if anyone's got any questions or anything to add. Hopefully you all were able to get the handout and the documentation as well, so that should give you some basic notes. In the sources, there's also some links to online recipes. Obviously, the Bible for if you like fermented foods, there's a book by Sandra Katz called Cultures for Health. It's a really wonderful resource. I was able to find a couple of references to Viking era sauerkraut, but it wasn't clear enough that I was confident to say this is legitimately a reference to sauerkraut. But yeah, so that's kind of the basic gist. Is anybody gonna give this a try?
Yes, that was awesome. I can't wait to try it.
Yay,
especially with garlic.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about the fermentation process and garlic, but it's so good. I usually use about 4 cloves of garlic per head of cabbage, but I have garlic on my coat of arms. I take garlic very seriously, so you probably can't overdo it, in my opinion.
I'm going to try it too.
Oh, good. I hope you do. I mean, one of the things I love about sauerkraut is it's like the cheapest food you can make. Like a head of cabbage is like 39 cents a pound and a couple tablespoons of salt. And the flavor that it adds to just about any food is so awesome. So yeah, at least.
Will you post the links on the event page too, so we can find them after you?
Sure. Yeah, I'll share them on the event page. So Elise was asking, how does it become sweet? It doesn't really become a sweet flavor. It's more of it goes from being just salty to being more like acidic and tangy tasting. Oh yeah, an Asian salad mix or like a coleslaw mix you get from the grocery store, that absolutely works for sauerkraut. I've done that before. Where you buy pre-shredded cabbage. You have to kind of beat it up a little bit more, so really like get in there to get it to release the liquid. Since it's been cut for a few days, the water content isn't quite as high, but just add your own. So
do you have a kimchi recipe?
Yeah, I'll share that on the page as well, but basically the hallmarks of kimchi are that gochujang chili paste that you can get at Asian grocery stores or on the internet, and they often have other types of vegetables as well. Daikon radish is really popular. There's one variety of kimchi that I've really wanted to try that's made entirely with green onions, and I think that sounds so good. You leave them like in long pieces, and
Wow.
yeah, and I mean, as a person who loves onions and garlic, that just seems like and with kimchi, it's more like a continuous process. The traditional process with kimchi is you sort of have a crock going and you add stuff in periodically and take stuff out periodically. Whereas with sauerkraut, I tend to make batch. We eat part of it and then I, make a separate batch in something else so we have a supply, but I don't continuously add to the same mix. I guess you could sort of use the liquid from the sauerkraut like a starter to make your next batch start fermenting faster. But that lactic acid bacteria that causes the fermentation is everywhere in our environment. It's like yeast. It's all over you right now. So you don't have to really introduce it. Yeah, isn't that a nice thought? So yeah, I wish I had some finish to share with you, but I ate it all. So if nobody else has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. But I am recording this, so I'll share the recording on the event page, and I'll share those links and the kimchi recipe link. And I highly encourage you to check out the Sander Katz book from the library. It's a really good resource, and he's got all kinds of recipes for lots of foods. And it's modern stuff. It's not medieval stuff, but yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks you guys for checking in. This has been really fun. And if you try this, let me know how it goes. And if anything goes weird, shoot me a message and I'm happy to diagnose. I usually do this as a make and take class at SCA events where everybody brings home their own little jar to ferment. But this is new territory.
Well done.
Thank you.
You're a good teacher.
Oh, well, I thank you. I enjoy it. That's my parent, in case anyone's curious about the bias there.
I think you did great too.
Oh, thanks. And that's my sister. Okay. Yeah, and hopefully I'll get to meet some of you that I haven't met yet. But until then, have a good day and stay healthy.
Thanks, you too.
You too.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye, Diane.